Welcome to Provoking Peace, a podcast by the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, where we bring Muslim and Jewish women and our allies into conversation to explore what it really takes to build peace in ourselves, our communities, and our world.
We go beyond the headlines to speak with people who are living this work every day: activists, educators, artists, faith leaders, and more.
We're here to ask bold questions, listen deeply, and invite you to join us in disrupting assumptions and stereotypes, one Muslim and
one Jewish woman at a time. So we're so thrilled today to have Dr. Daisy Khan with us. She's the founder and executive director of the Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, known as WISE, a woman-led organization committed to peace building, equality, and justice for Muslims around the globe. Born and raised during her early years in Kashmir, Dr. Khan emigrated to the United States as a teenager. Dr. Khan has been listed among Time Magazine's 100 most influential people and was ranked among the top 10 women faith leaders by the Huffington Post. She received a doctorate in interfaith ministry from the seminary in New York and is ordained as an interfaith minister. You can read more about her story in her 2018 memoir, Born with Wings: The Spiritual Journey of a Modern Muslim Woman. In her latest book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women, enables women to integrate an egalitarian Islamic belief system into their lives. So welcome, Dr. Khan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, we're so excited. Could you share a little bit about your personal journey, kind of what inspired you to become an activist and advocate for Muslim women's rights?
Yeah, I would say that now that I look at the trajectory of my leadership, it wasn't meant to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I, was a career woman. I came to the United States for my advanced studies to study architectural design. I had a career for 25 years, an architectural design career. So I was a career woman. And so I had never expected that one day I would be doing this kind of work. But I think now that I have had time to think about my life, I think a lot of my activism really began in my childhood. I was the third of three daughters, and I have this vivid memory of my father giving me a pair of boxing gloves. And I never really knew what that was all about, but that memory is seared in my brain. So I asked him years later if he had given me a pair of boxing gloves. He said yes. I said, why? Because I was a little girl. I was like 3 years old. And he said, oh, you were the third of three daughters, and somebody tried to bully you, and I wanted to teach you how to defend yourself, how to fight for yourself. So I remember those pair of boxing gloves gave me that confidence, especially from a man that I loved and revered. And in some ways, I think I have been walking around with these pair of boxing gloves, kind of like the black sheep of the family, a little bit of a rebel artist, coming to the United States, going through a whole identity crisis after the Iranian Revolution, not knowing who I was, getting fragmented, and trying to find myself in this big giant city. And then of all the places, I found God in Tribeca, which is like the most godless place. I was like, but I went into a kind of on a spiritual path, looking for myself, the lost soul that I was. And then ultimately I married an imam. And then shortly after that, 9/11 happened. And that is what precipitated me to assume a leadership role, because there was a need in the community. Everybody wanted to know from Muslims, what was Islam? Why was this happening in the name of Islam? The treatment of women. And I remember I was at a church and I was asked by a little old lady to explain the status of Muslim women. And, I rattled off all the things that I knew about Muslim women and the rights that Muslim women had gained in 7th century. But then she explained to me why then Afghan women are being treated this way. And of course, this was the Taliban at that time, the Taliban 0.0, not Taliban 2.0, which is now. And there were terrible images of women being whipped on the streets and in blue burqas and, voiceless, nameless. And I felt that I needed to do something for these women, because I had been empowered by Islam, by every Muslim man in my family had empowered me. So I decided that it was important for me to take on a more active role. And I wound up quitting my career because the woman asked me that very profound question, what are you doing about it, dear? You know?
Mhm.
And I was like, yeah, what am I doing about it, dear? So I quit the only way I could do this without having two jobs was to quit my career full time. And that's when I dedicated myself, literally not knowing what I was going to do. And then I just knew I had to do something. So that is what was the spark behind me wanting to step into the role.
Thank you. And I'm gonna, is it okay if I call you Daisy?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Okay. I just want to step back for a second and just thank you for joining us today. We're recording this episode during Ramadan. So we are with a little bit less of energy and little bit less of focus. So we're very, very grateful that you are with us today. And thank you for doing that. So I just wanted to
Yeah, without coffee, it's like we're at 50% energy level right now.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I'm usually much perkier audience. So if I'm not as perky as I normally am, I apologize for that. But we do work during the month of fasting full time. So
That's
but
right.
but we work at a slightly sluggish pace.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. But again, thank you for joining us. Your strength in general is quite remarkable and evident. But I wanted to ask you, how are you navigating this traditionally male-dominated field that you are in, and with such strong leadership, and also coming into sort of these legal issues that you're working with is traditionally very much male dominated, and I would just love to hear from you what your experience has been and what are your tools that
Yeah.
you use in this.
Well, let's go back to my childhood again because I find that everything is there.
Mm,
Like substrate of everything that we are, because there's so much we embody from what we learn in our childhood, right? And I mean, there are scientific studies about, I mean, if you experience trauma, then you carry that trauma into your future life. But if you experience, a good family, empowered women in the family, or women that are exemplars, then you carry that into your future as well. So I remember going to my grandmother's house, my maternal grandmother, and she was very devout. She used to pray all the time. She was the head of the household. That was a tradition in Kashmir. A woman, if her husband dies and she's the widow, she's basically de facto the leader of the entire household. Like nobody could go out without her permission. So she was the head of the household, but she was also a spiritual person. So I remember having these images of her, people coming and sitting at her feet, literally learning from her. And so I saw a woman in a religious role when I was a child. She didn't have a title. She didn't have robes. She didn't have turbans. She didn't have anything. She just had knowledge. And she was imparting it on that. She had so much wisdom. And so I saw a woman in that role. And today, this doctor title that I have kind of bothers me. And I'm like, I don't even want this title. I don't want robes. I don't want anything. I just want to do the leadership that I know I have the capacity to do. And I want to change the lives and I want to inspire people with what I have. But for me to get to the stage where my grandmother was to here, I had to learn a lot of things about my faith. I had to do a self study because if I'm going to be impactful within a community that is male dominated, at least the discourse is dominated primarily by men. But we also know that women have played a very significant part within our faith tradition. From the Quran is replete with women and the role that they played in there. So what do I need to do to be effective? So your question, I found that knowledge was the most important thing for me in order for me to be effective. If I am to communicate with men in power and I am communicating with people whose belief systems I want to change, I need to have the things in my toolkit that I know that are going to be effective, right? And so as we know, in Quran is the highest authority. It's literally the word of God. So understanding what is in the Quran, and the secondary to that is Prophet Muhammad and what he did and how he behaved with women and how he empowered women, how he enabled women. Those are the things that I needed to learn. So a lot of deep self-study, and I'm like a consummate student, I'm always like new books, learning, and I'm always getting inspired by these ancient medieval women who played such a sizable role, civilizational role, literally, and they're not known. And that's what led me eventually to write the book that I wrote. So to your point, my boxing gloves today are not physical boxing gloves. They are my books, and they're the knowledge that I carry. So for me, if I have to go into a fighting ring, then I need to have these books in my hand and say, this is what our book says. This is what the knowledge is. Now argue with me. So that's what made me effective. It's hard for people to argue with the Quran. And when I cite it and when I describe it, and when I say, well, what about the prophet when he said this? When they say women can't work. And I said, well, the prophet went to a woman and said, it's better for you to earn a living with your own hand than to be beholden to a man. Okay. This was a woman who was widowed or no, sorry, divorced. I mean, this is his example. He's trying to teach a woman, be honorable, earn a living with, be dignified. So pulling these things out and challenging people on that, but without, but coming from within the tradition and the belief system of the people, that's what makes us effective, and that's what is sustainable, because it's also transformative. And as I saw that in Afghanistan, when I went to Afghanistan and I was communicating with the Taliban directly. And I started citing the Quran, and I started talking about the references of, how education is so important. They were nodding their heads. They couldn't say no. They just couldn't say no.
That's incredible. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in Afghanistan with the Taliban?
Well, so I have been doing work in Afghanistan for many years with one of my partners, my Afghan partner, where we were doing imam training. So we learned a long time ago that the most effective, the most influential people in Afghanistan are the imams, the mullahs. And they're the ones that give the sermons, and everybody comes and they listen to their sermons. And so if your imam says, don't do this, then people won't do it. And if he says, do it, then they'll do it. So because people, Afghanistan been in war for almost 40 years, 40 something years. And not everybody has access to religious education. The seminaries have all gone. So people rely on their religious leaders for much of the information. So they don't know what their rights are, women as well as men. So we were educating the imams and teaching them that, child marriage is not Quranic based. You can't deny a woman her inheritance. A woman has a right to own a property. A woman has a right to education, all these core financial as well as spiritual rights. So that was then, and it was very effective. We have stories of transformation when the imams would literally receive the information from us, and they would be so shocked. They were like, wow, we didn't even know this. So they were learning a lot from us. And then they would go and give a sermon. And when they would give a sermon, they would, somebody in the audience would say, well, I didn't know that. Like a brother came up and said, we've never given our sister her inheritance. We haven't spoken to her for 10 years. And, what should we do? We brothers didn't split the property. And the imam said, well, you can't prevent her from having her inheritance. You have to go back and resettle it. And then when they went back and they resettled it, the family unified again. So, but they didn't know that. And these were men that did not know that that sister had a right to her property. So it's things like that. And then when U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and we heard that there was a clampdown on education, a bunch of us, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, atheist women, we were a small delegation, and we decided it's important for us to go back there because we had done work in Afghanistan. And so we met the Taliban face to face, and we convinced them. And they said, "You're right. We do want to educate women. We do want to educate our girls because our own girls want to be educated." So, unfortunately, after we came back, a majority of them got fired because they were too progressive for the leadership. The leadership wanted a different version of Afghanistan. And the Taliban that were agreeing with us were too progressive for them. So it's where there's not political will there, then the citizens can do nothing other than agitate. And if they don't even allow agitation, we're seeing we're getting a little taste of that here in the United States now for the first time. We're seeing what it's like when you have a very strong person at the top, how entire societies can get paralyzed. So our work right now is now online. And so we've gone back online, and the book that I wrote, I'm creating toolkits. And part of what I also want to do is communicate this information to them so it goes right into their smartphone, like through a podcast. And so I can deliver the information to them in a stealth way.
What you're saying is absolutely fantastic about building that sort of books as boxing gloves. I like that very much, and building that knowledge. I had a similar experience when going into one of, I'm not going to say where and when and all that, but a mosque for Juma. And Imam told me, women cannot be a Juma, right? It was just, I went plenty of times. And then I engaged him in a conversation about how would Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam react to what he just said, right? That he would be very unhappy with his statement. And so we went back and forth, and the whole argument ended with him saying, it's not good for a woman to know things so much. so I think that is exactly where those boxing gloves are, right? The knowledge, and it goes from like grassroots work where you just kind of whoever you communicate with to higher levels. So I always laugh at that it's not good for a woman to know.
Yeah. Well, if you read the chapter in my book, it's called Access to Sacred Spaces, basically mosque, you will see I took the time to write in detail what the Prophet's first mosque was like, and how it was like such a dynamic place with men and women, children mingling. There was not even a barrier in the mosque. There was no gender segregation. Yeah, women came from behind and men were in the front, but everybody came to the same entrance. It was a dynamic community center / sacred space. And women were equally represented. They were there. They were questioning him. They were talking to him. There are even Quranic references that show evidence that there were women in the mosque, because there's a verse that talks about these men who were like staring at a woman because she was a pretty woman. They kept looking at her when she would come into the mosque. And the Quran is like damning these men. So if a woman was not in the mosque, why would there be a verse that talks about these men who are looking at this pretty woman? So there's so much evidence. So I wrote that article with vengeance because I wanted to give evidence to women to fight. Next time you go in there, you can just take that article and say, explain this to me, please. Explain this to me. Why was this like, and why, and aren't you following the tradition of the Prophet?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway.
Incredible. I come from a Jewish background, and the way that I kind of think about the different types of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, there's many of them, is sort of different ways of interpreting the same texts and teaching. Reform kind of in a more modern context, Orthodox more traditional context, etc. It sort of sounds to me like what you're kind of interpreting, you're almost going back to the original kind of interpretation of Islam and kind of taking out the sort of modern political and geographic context that have kind of been put upon it. Yeah. Is that an accurate interpretation? Or if not, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about it.
I mean, we have our literalists, people who read the text literally, and but text has to always be written in context, interpreted in context of the verse that verse came, because these verses, Prophet Muhammad was a prophet for more than 2 decades, and he was a living prophet. It's not like he lived a short time and then other people wrote books about him. No, it was the revelation was coming directly to him. And the revelations were coming primarily in response to issues that were happening. So an issue would arise, a woman would come to the prophet and she would complain to him that my husband wants to divorce me, and because he called me his mother, and the prophet didn't have an answer. Like, what is he supposed to do? He doesn't know. He doesn't have the answer to something and so he waits for a revelation, or a revelation immediately comes to him. And Angel Gabriel says, say to them this, And so these revelations and in the context which they came is very important. So the context is important. So when I interpret, I always go back to how did this verse come about? What was this all about? And who was this woman? And then explain it from that perspective. When you read the Quran that way, it becomes extremely egalitarian. It's such an egalitarian scripture after you understand that,
Mhm.
and that's what boggles my mind is how, it came in response to even when the prophet's wife, who herself was a very a force for nature. This is not Khadija. This is his wife after Khadija died. She was a very prominent family, and she came to him, and she had heard women whispering that why is the Quran only speaking to men? In other words, the scripture was mostly addressing men. Oh, you men do this. Oh, you men do that. Hardly any women. So she went to the prophet and she said, "Why is the Quran? Why is God only addressing women? Like we men, like we are your followers. We're here too." And that's when the most beautiful verse of the Quran came, 33, 35. Basically, the most egalitarian verse of the Quran, and was revealed as it was in response to a woman's query. So there are lots of things like that in the Quran where a woman is questioning and a verse is coming, or a man is questioning and a verse is coming. So I always try to explain that in my book in great detail of how that happened.
One of the things that I love most about Judaism or Jewish culture is this tradition of questioning of, an old saying that if you have, six rabbis in a room, you'll have, 10 opinions. And, is that you're constantly kind of wrestling with the text and, with interpretations. Is that a tradition in Islam as well? Or is that how you kind of have been, wrestling with the Quran in your way?
Well, in some ways, a lot of that wrestling was going on during the time of the prophet, right? Because people were constantly questioning, because he was a living prophet, and they were like, "What is God saying about this?" Right? So after the Quran was assembled and it was sealed, it was like we don't necessarily question the text and say, "Why is this text here?" But we try to understand it, right? We try to contextualize it. We try to create commentaries that begin to make sense. In other words, we are almost prohibited from like changing the text or deleting the text, or it's something that we are prohibited from doing. But because the Quran can be read literally, it can be read egalitarian way, it can be mystical, it can be metaphorical in so many different ways, right? So you have great scholarship that developed over time, and we even have like 5 schools of thought, and each school has its own sort of like lens, or but from the same piece of scripture you might have, like, for instance, there are like 30 interpretations, English translations of the Quran right now. And when I say translations, I mean the same text being translated a little differently, right, by 30 different people. So each one is saying, no, this word actually means something different. It has a double meaning, or it doesn't mean beat, it means go away. So that kind of splitting of hairs is also happening in the Muslim community. It's not that, but what I wished we would do, which I learned from the Jewish tradition, I wish we would study in pairs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I found that very interesting because we did a joint Jewish Muslim study of text many years ago in a mosque. And then and the rabbi said, well, we don't do this by ourselves. We do it in pairs. And when we came together as pairs, we were able to take the literalist and the metaphorical and the spiritual, and all of a sudden the text just became so rich because you have all these different perspectives that you were bringing. So yeah, I wish there would be more joint study, that we could benefit from that wisdom. So we don't. I mean, you will not, in the Jewish tradition. It's almost like a sense of pride that you're questioning, right? But we Muslims, we don't say that. But there are different interpretations from scholars, from people who are studying the text, and each interpretation can be valid. Or sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, that Quran, don't even go near it. It's like, I mean, it's by a person that that they don't have respect for." But it's become quite normative to now see different, ways of interpreting the text emerging, especially as women take a very key role in interpreting some of the best books, in my opinion. In the books on social issues, especially women's issues, have been written by women themselves. Great women scholars, like really teasing out the words and the meanings and going deep into the hermeneutics of the scripture.
So I just want to say, well, Sisterhood started a program called Havruta Halaqa, which is based on what you're mentioning, studying in Paris, Havruta and Halaqa, studying as a group.
Yeah.
The circle. So we have that parallel of bringing more, because it's so important to hear each other and learn from each other. So we have that. I just want to reflect on something you said in some of my conversations with my Jewish sisters. We get into this that, she said, this particular sister said, we wrestle with God. In Judaism, we wrestle with God. And I said to her, in Islam, we submit to the will of God, but we wrestle with ourselves, right? So I think it comes to the same thing, but that's sort of something we call higher or greater jihad, is wrestling with your own knowledge and your own interpretation and your own understanding at all times, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we wrestle with the God within us because we become godlike, and we begin to think that, that somehow we are equal to God because we're God's creature, and we've been created with that because of the free will we've been given. And the example the Quran describes Pharaoh as like, never become like a Pharaoh-like, because the moment you become like a Pharaoh-like, you're tyrannical, like you rejection of God and oppression and everything else stems from that. So this is why in the Islamic tradition, especially in Islamic mystical tradition, Sufi tradition, wrestling with your ego is like the biggest thing that you can do. And that's what keeps you grounded in faith. Right? So we don't wrestle with God per se. That's almost like blasphemous for us. But because we consider God to be so supreme that we have no right to wrestle, but we have the right to wrestle with ourselves, which is the God within us, or the Satan that is misguiding us. Yeah. But we submit to the will of God. Submission to the will of God is just listening to your inner, it's not like somehow people think that submission to God is like such a level of obedience that you don't have that you're not thinking freely, I'm submitted to God, but I'm a complete free thinker. And, I'm kind of like, I'm an example of a person that is submitted to the will of God. Will of God means, God, what do you want me to do next? What do you want from me? How should I behave? What is, what are the demands that I have to meet? What are the requirements? So that's submission to us, is like fulfilling the covenant, so to speak.
Exactly.
In the Jewish terms.
Yeah.
And you understand what that is, what the will of God is, through your understanding and knowledge of the Quran. Is that?
Yeah, well, some of it is personal also. Some of it is like, just meeting the basic requirements, like you would say, staying committed to the Torah. So in the Quran, there are certain things that we're supposed to do, like we're supposed to give charity, right? And so this is the month of charity. So now all of us, I saw an example of this the other day. My parents were sitting, they're both elderly, like almost in the 90s, and they were sitting down meticulously writing the list of all the people the charity has to go to. And I looked at my mother. I said, where do you have all this money? She said, I have some gold in the bank and I have to give the charity for that gold. So Muslims know what they're supposed to do. And so that's one level, right? Staying true to what God wants you to do. But then there's a whole new, different level of submission to God, which is I submitted to God when I married somebody, because I did not think I was supposed to marry this person. I was like, okay, this is something that you willed for me. So this is the conversation that goes on between you and God. Do you really want me to do this? Should I do this? Should I embark on this? Is this good for me? And that's another level, which is the level of taking responsibility for something, right? Mm-hmm. Like maybe a responsibility is being discharged on you and it's a very heavy responsibility. And then you say, no, God is willing this for me and I need to accept this responsibility. So in my case, when I quit my career, I was so convinced that God wanted me to do this work for God's sake, that I was positioned I was placed. I was, this was the right time. That I didn't even think about it. I was like, okay, it's time to quit. It's time to quit because something bigger is going to come out of this. And that's what, happens when you become that channel and you remain an open channel for God, right? So that's the ongoing conversation that we have. And because we don't have an intermediary, we don't have a church, we don't have anybody else, we can have this direct line of communication with God, similar to in the Jewish faith.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more? Instead of, I was going to comment on that, but I would love to ask you to comment on that. The piece here that, is so important is, yes, will of God is everything, right, in existence. However, there is action piece that we carry in us and what we do to move that sort of towards the outcome that we want to have.
Yeah.
So I always remember that, tie your camel, which is one of the most commonly quoted examples. But it's so important for us also, especially in this moment where there is so much going on in and around us, to understand that we do carry responsibility to be in action,
Yeah.
to do things.
Yeah, and so that comes from a verse of the Quran which talks about doing good and preventing evil, right? So, and that's a mandate, like it's called hisba, right? It's a requirement for all humans, like, promote the good and prevent the evil or prevent bad. So this is something that you always have to keep in mind as whatever you are doing. If you are doing if God is willing you to do something, you just have to say, am I preventing evil? Am I doing the good? It's an easy way to figure out whether you go this way or you go that way. And that's what makes it so easy to then follow a particular path, right? So, when I embarked on writing my book, I was like so scared to write the book because, I mean, I'm not a trained scholar per se. I'm a lay scholar. I've learned everything on the job. But then I said, this is going to do good. This is going to do good for women. So go ahead, Daisy, just take the charge. It's okay. Some people may not read it, but those who will read it will benefit from it. So that's what gave me the confidence to say, step up and do it because it's good for society. It's good for people. It'll be good for those people who will need it. So it's an easy way to figure out what action to take and when you should, when you should take an action for either.
Speaking about, Judaism and Islam and what the sisterhood does, we just wanted to ask you about, since you have worked on all kinds of extreme interpretations and behaviors and tried to counteract those and worked a lot on anti-Muslim bigotry. In the sisterhood, we're not using Islamophobia and anti-Semitism for a number of reasons, and we can go into that discussion, but we're using terminology anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish bigotry. And we see them as a similar or very connected expressions of hate and bigotry. And we would love to hear from you about your work on against anti-Muslim bigotry and its connection to anti-Jewish bigotry.
Yeah. Well, I think that when I created WISE, I created the organization with furthering three things. One is a peaceful society that is then anchored in gender equality and then human dignity. Because all of these three things are very central to our faith, right? Including justice. So justice is always there. But, for me, all of my work is centered around these three. So when we talk about anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish bigotry, we're talking about human dignity. We're talking about treating people with respect and dignity that they deserve because they're all God's creatures. We're all born with dignity. The state hasn't given us dignity, and we have a right to lead a dignified life. We have a right to be, free. We have a right to not be suppressed and oppressed. And we have a right to, that this Constitution gives us, which is very much aligned with the values of my faith, and I know with Jewish values. As a result of that, I have done a fair amount of work on countering Islamophobia and also countering anti-Semitism as a result of that by speaking in synagogues and in turn, partnering with Jewish partners to see how we can prevent our two small religious communities, because we are roughly the same size in the United States, we are the two smallest faith communities here in the United States that are, simultaneously confronted by this bias. And especially when things happen overseas, our two communities get impacted directly here. Similarly, when our community got impacted by what was happening with ISIS and Al Qaeda, we were the ones who were confronted by that menace here because everybody saw us through that lens. And so we had to, de-link ourselves from those people.
Mhm.
And I always tell people that Islamophobia does not have theological roots. I mean, per se, the Crusades were doing things that were Islamophobic, but it doesn't have like deep theological roots. But it is mostly, being triggered by external events that are happening overseas that then are beamed into the press here, and then what the press consumes and the Americans consume, then the narrative gets shaped that way. And we all know the importance of narrative and how important it is how when the press has a particular narrative. So our two communities get impacted one way or the other by what's happening overseas, and we have to pick the brunt of it. Majority of the brunt of it we have to face. And this is the unfortunate reality. Unless things get solved overseas, we're probably going to see those tensions rise. And I'm afraid they might even rise more and impact, the great work that was done over the years by Jewish and Muslim partners coming together and, strengthening ties and forming friendships and bonds. All of that can be frayed very quickly because emotions run deep and people go back into their own communities, and it's a survival instinct. So I'm not that optimistic because I see certain things that might happen that might really confront us, like test our relations here. And as a result of that, there's going to be a spike one way or the other in either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. There's going to be a spike because then other people who are not from our communities, then they come in and they weigh in. All we can do is continue to educate one another and bring awareness and keep our community safe, from harm. That's all we can do right now. And I didn't want to leave on such a bleak note. I'm sorry.
No, it's important to be realistic and hopeful, right? So I think and we are already, even the sisterhood had many, many challenges over the past 2 years that we keep working on and keep finding new ways to address some of these issues that keep coming up, and that is it is a challenge. And we remain hopeful that we'll manage to get through these challenges as much as possible. And I think you touched on something that is so important. In addition to Orientalism, that was really set the tone for anti-Muslim bigotry and affected how people saw Muslims early on. The media these days, we wanted to just ask you to reflect a little bit on what we're overwhelmed with the information, and at the same time mainstream media is really continue with the same sort of focus that is not very helpful. So I wanted to ask you about media effect on how Muslim women are perceived, and also connected with anti-Muslim bigotry as well. But how does it affect how Muslims are perceived?
Yeah, as I mentioned that from the very early days when we began to see images, being shown on television of women, being whipped and honor killed and treated by the Taliban in such a brutal fashion, that those images that have been continuously coming through the press into people's living rooms, literally for the last 40 years. And 40 years of negative imaging with very little positive imaging to balance the negative, meaning not too many Muslims are brought on to counter that. Even when ISIS was going on, there were hardly, they would bring some analysts, and those analysts would analyze the problem, but they didn't really bring Muslims on and said, wow, this is like so un-Islamic. This is like They didn't show that. I wrote a book on extremism, Wise Up Knowledge and Extremism, 365 pages to basically counter ISIS and Al Qaeda. And I was not brought on to talk about it, but I know so many other people that were there always bantering about and analyzing the problem. So the issue is how the press chooses to frame the story, you know? And so it's been very convenient to frame Muslims as a national security threat from the very beginning because it was politically expedient to do that. Because when you do that, then you can go and wage a war. Then you can go to Iraq and kill because they're part of the enemy. It's just like a game. It's like what the politicians want you to do, then the media becomes like the arm for the politicians. And this is so evident to us now. Maybe it wasn't evident to people before, but now it's become really evident. As you'll see right here, press freedom being curbed here in the United States now. Everybody's scared. Like people are changing shows, people are firing people because they want to be aligned with the political forces. And this is something we've seen overseas in other countries, right? Press freedoms were curbed. The way to challenge this, is to inform the media. But media is a big machine, and it's very hard to do. And I took my work. I created Wise as a result of this negative imaging, right? People were constantly talking about Muslim women. I said, well, that's not who we are. We got rights in 7th century Arabia, the right to inheritance, the right to property, the right to have a career, the right to education, all the rights that Western women have that we already received it in 7th century through scripture, So why then do we have to continue to show Muslim women as oppressed, especially here in the United States, when they're not oppressed, when that in the last election, more than 24 women ran and like 20 of them won. So they're civically engaged, they're, professional women, working women, contributing significantly to their society, their community. I'm just one example of that. Tahia, you're another example of that. We're leading organizations and we come from all over the globe. So, so here you have an example of how Islam empowers women and how women are taking what they believe to be their responsibility, to serve their community. And it's a real example of that. So why the press continues to show that, I fundamentally believe that it has something to do with, political. It's just another way to like allow certain kinds of wars to continue. And as long as you demonize a community, you can do a lot to that community. So unfortunately, other communities are experiencing this. Simultaneously, they experienced that. We went from Ukraine being the love, the beloved child, to like overnight people saying, yeah, why are we giving money to Ukraine? So now the whole narrative is changing. And overnight, it's just the whole narrative shifted because of a political will. So then the media then has to report, then the media then falls in line and starts reporting that way. Unfortunately, I don't know why they can't be more independent, but, they're afraid too.
Yeah.
Your book, it seemed, to me that it was focused on educating Muslim women about, their own rights through Islam. Do you also use it to sort of educate others about, the way that women are perceived and the rights that they have within Islam as well?
That is one of the reasons I wrote it. Is my audience is supposed to be, women of faith. So it's not just, a Jewish one can read it and see threads of something within her faith, because so many of the stories in the Quran also relate to the biblical stories of the faith traditions, the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. So there are stories of, Moses and how he was adopted, extensive. So I wrote those to show that, kind of like how our faiths are also connected, that especially with Islam, because being the last revelation, it's really just these revelations deliberately address the predecessor communities, because God wants to show that there is only one God and that prophets were sent to different people. The message was sent to different people at different times, and God deliberately. Otherwise, why would God spent so much time in retelling the stories of, Jesus and Mary and Moses and Aaron and Shuaib and all these people that exist in all of our faiths. So it's to show that we're all one and God is one and we're all his creatures. So it has an interfaith element to it. And if people read it and with an open mind, they will see that in there. And I also wanted to show that the role that women have played in, the spiritual role that women have played as spiritual emissaries of God is very central to all of our three faiths. In other words, women are not like a sideshow. They're not like how they are perceived in our religious communities as, men have the leadership role and women have subservient domestic role. That's not how the Quran describes it. The Quran shows these women as being co-stewards of the prophets. They were literally by the side of the prophets. Either they saved them, or they taught them, or they promoted them, or they financed them. They were always there. So I'm not sure why we can't read the scripture that way, because it's so evident. It's so evident that women play such a central role, that they were placed in these positions. How would Moses have been adopted if a woman didn't pick him up from the little basket? I mean, why was she given that role? And then she challenged the prophet. I mean, it was God who made sure that she picked up, she saw the child, she brought him in, fought with the prophet, fought with the Pharaoh, raised him. And then, so we have so many stories like that. I mean, why was Mary given Jesus? Like, it's like, why? A miraculous birth? What? Such a traumatic story, when you think in modern terms, like a single woman who's unmarried, who then has a child and then has to run around with this child, and then Prophet Muhammad, being paired up with Khadija, who's a successful businesswoman, and then he has to marry her, and she's older than him, and he accepts the marriage. And then they have a beautiful marriage together, monogamous marriage at a time when everybody has like hundreds of wives and one single couple with a monogamous marriage. And then he receives a revelation. And then she has this wealth and she puts all her wealth at his disposal. So these women served a very important purpose to help the prophets to continue with their missions, because they would not have been able to continue with their missions. So we always hear about the apostles, the people that were by the side of the prophet, the men, but very rarely do we talk about these women and the role that they played.
Well,
I wanted to bring that out. Again, I was like trying to show these women and the role that they played.
We're very familiar with selective history, right? Not just in many cases where we need to sort of retell the history and related to in other contexts when we need to bring to the light what really was there. But I want to sort of just add to what you're saying. Your book is so rich in information and rich in stories that support the arguments or the evidence you're bringing. I also think that what you're saying it is for Muslim women, and at the same time, the way you address some of very complex issues in this book are digestible enough to really wide audience.
Yeah.
So you really can approach it from someone who you can either have a lot of background in understanding what you're referring to or very little, and you can still sort of gain the core of what you're trying to convey.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, because I wrote an article. I mean, all these articles that are in the book address a lot of the stereotypes that people have about women. So number one, so that's really for the broader community. So if you think that, Muslim women are supposed to be FGM, female genital mutilation, no, they're not. Here's an article that'll show you why they're not, right? Or the child marriage is so Islamic. No, they're not. Here's why, here's an example of why not. That Muslim women are, lack education. Well, guess what? The oldest running university in the world, in the Guinness Book of World Records, was founded by a Muslim woman. And and in 8th century. So there are all these stories that kind of challenge the stereotype, and explain in great detail why that stereotype has no basis to it. Or it is a stereotype in the sense that there are some Muslims that do that, but this is not. It's not Quranic based. It's not faith based. It's just men who, with outdated attitudes, are stripping women of their rights, and that happens in many societies. And to some extent, we experienced it here with Roe versus Wade. I mean, who thought that was going to get overturned? Did anybody ever imagine that? I know women who fought for that for so many years, and they can't believe that it just happened. But that's what happens when you have strong-willed people coming together with people of faith who want to overturn something, and then it happens very quickly.
Yeah.
So, religion gets weaponized for political aim. So yeah, I did write the book specifically also to help people understand what women's rights were, because so many of the people always struggled. And I know men who carry this book with them, and they say, "Oh yeah, well, everything's in here, If I ever need to know anything about anything, I just go in there and I read it." It's like, so I wrote it like a reference book, so you always have something that on your shelf where you can just pick it up. I also know Jewish people who read my book, Jewish women who are scholars who read my book, said, "Why didn't we think about doing this? Oh my God." One of the rabbis said to me, "We need to write a book like this." I said, "Well, go ahead. I'd be happy to see that, Yeah.
Absolutely. I do see it as something where you grab and you look, for example, I was telling Ali, just as we were sort of discussing the book, that it feels like this is a reference book, like I can go and just find things. So that's amazing to have. And so thank you for doing it. And again, the book is called 30 Rights of Muslim Women. If you could share with our audience and with Ali and I one piece of music or film or a book you would recommend to our listeners. It can be anything, but something that is inspiring and something that inspires you.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I read so many books. They all inspire me in so many ways. I tell people, just read your holy book. Honestly, there's so much wisdom in them. There's so much wisdom in them. And, this is the month of Ramadan. Oftentimes people think this is the month of fasting, but this is also the month when the Quran was first revealed. And that's why this month is special. So it was like, this is when Prophet Muhammad was in a cave, contemplating, wondering why his society had gone so bad. And Angel Gabriel came, gave him a hug from behind, and told him to start reciting. And he was stunned. And this kind of like God revealing himself onto man, happened in the last 10 days of Ramadan. And this month, we're supposed to read the Quran. We're supposed to read the Quran from start to finish the whole Quran. And so Muslims have divided the Quran into 30 segments. We call them juz. Each day you read one. Every year I read the Quran, I see different things in there. I'm like, whoa, what? I never saw that verse before. What was that all about? So it's so fascinating and that's why I think that, I tell people, read your holy book, try to read it as much as you can, because there's so much wisdom in there. And we have steered, so we're looking for influencers, we're looking for this one and that one to tell me what I should think. I said, when you get inspired by the divine itself, it's very transformative. My advice is stick with the foundation of the source of everything.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
What keeps you at the table? What keeps you engaged in, fighting, anti-Muslim bigotry and, helping women, claim their power? What keeps you engaged in this work?
Allison, I look at everything from a spiritual perspective. And my perspective is I have so many days on this earth. And I must do as much as I can, as much impact as I can, as quickly as I can, because I don't know when I'm going to go. And so I've decided that my time is best spent in serving my community in all kinds of ways that my community needs me. Not just my community. When I say my community, means the American community, the general public, my community. Because I'm a peacemaker, fundamentally. I've always believed in peace. I don't like war. I've never been a war person. And so I think that I have to fulfill this mandate as quickly as I can and do as much as I can. And so that creates like a sense of urgency within me. Like I haven't done enough, you know. I still have to do this. Now I have to do the podcast, right? Now I have to probably write another book because I didn't address that issue. So in some ways, it's highly motivating when you have that sense of urgency that you have to do a lot because you can pack a lot within the confines of the time. Like I've decided my priority is to do this, so I prioritize my time accordingly. And you know, also the fierce urgency that all the gains that we've made are just like somebody's just come and pulled the rug from underneath us, and we're just like sliding all the way back. And we thought we had evolved so much. We had evolved in our relationships. We had evolved in the way we do things. We, the interfaith community, had done so much work. And now we're going from interfaith, from the United Faiths of America to the divided. So we have like a divider in chief. And so I call myself the uniter in chief now. Now I have to like ramp up my uniter in chief sense because I want to unite people and I don't want to see division. I want to unite. I want us to do the right thing. I want us to promote the good and prevent the evil. And that's what keeps me going because there's so many things to do, so many things to fix. And yeah, I don't think I'm ever going to retire, Allison.
That's well, there's too much to do. There's too much to do.
Retirement is for those people who have the luxury to retire. I don't have the luxury to retire.
No, we definitely need you in the sisterhood too, with that kind of energy and attitude, and really very much needed. And for the end, this podcast is called Provoking Peace. We chose this title because peace means different things to different people. We have different theories and definitions of peace, and we want to provoke it. We want to provoke others to think about difficult things and difficult issues that we want to talk about in order to bring peace. So, could you tell us what peace means to you?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Kashmir and we lived in a very multi-religious environment. You know, I went to Christian school because, you know, everybody went to Christian schools because these were the private schools. Everybody that I know. I went to a Christian school. I did the Lord's Prayer every morning, and you know that was fine. Then we had Hindu professors. I was hanging out with, you know, Sikh girls, and we bought stuff from Buddhists, and we were told we were from the lost 10 tribe of Israel, even though I'd never met a Jewish person. So during my childhood, I saw what it is to honor and respect the other and to respect other faith traditions because we had so many holidays, you know, of the different faith traditions. And it was a custom when it was your holiday, you would give a gift to that person. In other words, when it was Eid, the Hindus and the Sikhs and everybody would come and give us a gift. And it was their holiday, we would give them a gift. So just to honor them, to show them that we acknowledge you, we acknowledge why this is important to you. And that to me was what harmony and peace was like. And today I see a big split in India, right? And it's all coming from the politicians. It's not coming from the ordinary folks at all. The ordinary folks are still doing the same things they used to do. And now people are supposed to hate each other. Now people are supposed to be suspicious of one another. Now people are supposed to be in fear of one another. How did that happen? You know? And so we have to be very careful when somebody is trying to provoke us or trying to divide us, that we have to make sure that we don't allow that kind of division. Because once these divisions take root, then it takes a long time to undo that division. Because people, you know, as you know, when fear permeates within a human being, then people become very tribal, and then, you know, they try to just like stick with their own community out of that fear. And we can't afford that in America. We are neighbors with one another. We are minority faiths in America. We are, you know, we need one another. But we have to, the only way to bring peace between us is to have more honest conversations.
Yeah.
I think honest conversations about our points of view, not necessarily to convert the other to our point of view, but to just understand where the other's coming from, and to try and see the root cause of what got us here. And then let the conversation happen. The most important thing is to let the conversation happen. Oftentimes, people don't even want to converse because they're so afraid that the other point of view is going to be so different and so challenging to other person's narrative that you don't even have a conversation. I think that if we have decided to be part of a dialogue group, part of a group that brings communities together, then we have to set a very high standard for ourselves. And recently, I've been doing Islamophobia trainings in corporations. And the first thing is always about how do we converse about this topic? And one of the law firms that I spoke at said that they didn't have a problem with Jewish and Muslim colleagues. They had a problem with two Jewish partners who stopped talking to one another because they were on two opposite spectrums. So we recognize that there are spectrums within the communities, but how do you know that unless you converse, right? That's what's interesting to me, is like the more honest conversations you have and active listening, and just let share the information with the other person share the information, not necessarily trying to conclude or come to some resolution, but to hear each other out. That's the most important thing right now. So we can
humanize each other.
So we can come to some understanding, a broader understanding of, where the other is coming from.
That's really what the sisterhood focuses on, is that exchange of ideas to have deeper understanding of each other. Not to come to some, mythical place where everyone agrees and, and everything is perfect. That's just, we're allowed to have different views. It just helps you understand who we are, and to humanize each other. I think we have a huge problem with, people not seeing someone else as a full human with thoughts and feelings and histories and ideas. Talking and listening, especially listening to someone else's story, helps you do that for sure.
Yeah. Because everybody wants to be heard, everybody wants to be acknowledged, and everybody wants to be respected. That's what human beings want, right? I mean, the moment they don't get that, then they feel that they are being marginalized, minimized. So, we're not going to be able to solve the world problems by ourselves, but what we can do is we can have an impact and influence on our own communities.
Yeah.
And that's where change begins, within ourselves and within our own circle. And then it gets widened out, and then you influence more people.
And it is a hard work. It's hard work,
but it's the work that we've all committed to doing from the very get-go, right? And so, what is the option? There is no other option. The other option is to walk away from one another and then let the opponents win.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm saying it's a hard work is that with understanding how much every single person that engages in this process contributes to creating peace and creating community. So it is not an easy work, but something so necessary and so important.
Yeah.
And sacred work, right?
Yeah.
It is a hard and sacred.
Yeah, exactly. If we are, if we are people of consciousness and God consciousness, then we have an obligation, a divine obligation almost.
Yeah.
To be lift up others through these conversations, because when you listen to others, I find it fascinating, because I'm generally a curious person by nature, and I love listening to people who are on the opposite spectrums, because I'm like, wow, I never realized that people could actually have that point of view. or they actually come from but then when you dig deeper and you dig deeper and you dig deeper, the source is always the same. Either it's some fear of something, or it's something that is rooted in an emotion that there's some emotion there that you have to tap into. And so
well, thank you so much for this.
Oh, well, thank you. This was fun.
Amazing conversation. I just want to say to the lady who asked, what are you doing about it, dear? You're doing a lot, dear.
Yeah.
It is truly an honor and pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much.
Are there any questions you've always wanted to ask a Jew or a Muslim, but didn't know how or where to go? Ask us at podcast@sosspeace.org. We don't speak for everyone in our communities, but we're happy to give you answers from our own perspectives. And to learn more about the sisterhood, subscribe to the newsletter on our website, sosspeace.org.
If this conversation moved you, challenged you, or made you think, we'd love for you to share it, leave a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The opinions of speakers and hosts do not always reflect official positions of the sisterhood. All rights to video and audio content belong to the sisterhood. Until next time, keep listening,
Keep learning,
and keep provoking peace.